China of today is not China of the 1980s when Nixon starts his process. I love looking at China because look at what they've done with their infrastructure. They have debt, but they've spent that debt in building 24,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. How many thousands of kilowatt hour of electricity are they producing? Yes, they're using coal, but they're also producing nuclear plants at a very fast rate that eventually will kick in. Look at the US. What have they spent their trillions of dollars? Endless wars. So it's great for the military industrial complex, but as Eisenhower warned, another guy from the class of 1907, right? That has to change, right? And so that change is really what I think is more important to me, in that the U.S. has the wherewithal to rebuild itself. They just need good leadership, as Churchill said. They'll try everything until they try the right thing, and so that's why I'm optimistic of the U.S. I think Asia comes out ahead. I think I love what the BRICS are doing, and with Brazil in the middle, it's good for Latin America. India, the changes that are occurring. And you know what? It's funny because all of these Trump induced changes of tariffs, look at India. It's forcing them to finally swim on their own, right? And I think that's important because that's what these countries needed, was a kick in the butt to start functioning outside of Western influence. So that's extremely positive to me because I finally see the world rising outside of Western influence. So to me, and I look at history, we're witnessing the end of the Anglo-American empire as structured since the 1700s, right? And the rise of a completely new world. I hate the world order, but a new restructuring led in a better way by a global system where we finally begin to understand each other. That's the other problem, is that, at the end of the day is we need to have an understanding as humans and an acceptance of each other. Um, in other words, love, right? Love and caring for each other. And I think that's also changing. So from a big perspective, I'm very optimistic of the future as we go through this economic cleansing that we have to go through. The problem is that people aren't preparing for the cleansing, which is what I'm kind of doing, looking forward.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it as well. Sometimes I'm like, can the system just bloody collapse so we can get to the other end of this? But I know there's about 5 or 6 years to go before the way this plays out and stuff. And in fact, my view is China will be the new financial capital of the world because also, as you mentioned, they took on debt, but they used it productively to build not only factories and all that stuff and railways and roadways and all of that stuff.
Let me say something about China that is funny because first time I noticed how China was filtering into Chile was in the mid '90s when I started traveling with Bank of Montreal to Chile, and I became friends with economic attaché because he happened to be at the same hotel that I was at in Santiago, and he said to me, "Our biggest misconception is that we got to figure out how to be understood." And that to me was, oh wow, never thought about that. But then I started thinking, and I've watched China how they've dealt with Chile. Okay, so Chile is the biggest copper producer in the world. Prior to the 1980s, the US was the biggest exporter of that copper and it was paid in US dollars. Today, all that copper goes to China. But China's approach to Chile was completely different than the Americans. The Americans, Allende comes in, he nationalizes the copper, which I said was a problem, but then they kill him and institute a completely different government to work under what the US wanted, right? So complete imperialism. China, on the other hand, they went to Chile and they said, hey, we need that copper. What do you need to get it out? Well, they helped to build a new harbor they did the same thing in Peru. They've helped with the infrastructure, but they've never, ever have tried to change the government. They said to Chileans, you guys do things the way you want to do them, but we just got to make sure that that copper gets out of the ground and we have access to it, which they do. The only piece of the puzzle missing is the fact that why do they have to continue to pay in US dollars now? So China's approach to the world has been completely different than the American approach or the British approach, which was, or the French approach. Look at what's happening in Africa and go back to Burkina Faso. Well, yeah, colonialism ended a long time, but not monetary colonialism. And these countries are waking up, right? So why should the price of uranium be so low in Africa to the benefit of the French who are using that uranium, right? So that's the positives that I see about the world rising, and China is leading that because they're also helping these countries to develop. So to me, it's a better feng shui going forward, a better karma in terms of how it's being done, and I see that very positively.
I think as you mentioned, obviously they say you get more honey with sugar, and that is exactly what China is trying to do. Whereas the Western imperial cultures that you've said have tried to put their boot on people's faces and tried to be the bully in the room and get all of these resources. And what I found recently was Russia standing up finally, especially when this happened with Ukraine. And again, I am going to definitely bring you on again because we will need to talk geopolitics and macro, what's happening with the BRICS countries and all of that in the future. We'll get you down the track. But I think Russia finally standing up and China knowing that they've got to back Russia because if Russia collapses, they're going after China next. And the BRICS countries are now becoming powerful. There's about 40 countries lining up to actually be part of this. And it could actually then split into a bilateral system rather than the US being the hegemony. And I think US is still fighting for that spot. Europe's already gone. Europe's gone. I think the euro collapses over the next 3 years, as you're seeing what's happening in the UK and France. But I think it is good to see these Asian economies, ASEAN, as you would say, also binding together and supporting each other because they're the ones with all the commodities and the resources. So they do not
Mhm.
necessarily need the Europes of the world and they can trade amongst themselves. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, that you know what, it's silly not to understand those changes because they are happening. It's here, and if you don't see it, I think that
You miss out.
you're living in a bubble. Exactly, and those changes are inevitable and they are occurring. And gold, silver are at the core of it. Definitely gold, but it is a geopolitical shift that's going to reshape our future, the future of our children. And to me, that's the benefit. That's the opportunity.